What it comes down to, though, and I'd say our most mature customers, is the security engineering teams are working, hand in hand with developers. The same things like identity, detective controls, infrastructure security, the perimeter, all that can now be defined in software.
Technology is transforming how we think, how we lead, and how we win. From InterVision, this is Status Go, the show helping IT leaders move beyond the status quo, master their craft, and propel their IT vision.
Hello and welcome to Status Go. I am Derek Brost and have with me today Bill Shinn. Today we're talking about cloud security, specifically a few topics dealing with the changing culture of engineering and security, which has evolved quite a bit from yesteryear. We'll also cover some common patterns and practices in successfully managing risk in cloud operations. And then, time permitting, Bill and I will go over some of the innovations in emerging services when it comes to detective, preventative, restorative controls that make cloud security journey more efficient and effective, hopefully. I wanted to share with everyone. I'm excited to have Bill on the show because I was present, Bill, when you were presenting to our executive team when we had come in to Seattle there for the AWS Premier Partnership EBC meeting that we had. And you were one of the presenters. Obviously, I'm a biased audience in security, but you were one of the presenters, and it was fascinating to kind of hear you talk specifically to that executive audience. That was great. So I'm excited. Can you tell us, Bill, kind of a little bit of your story? How did you get, where you are? How did you get to this role in this position?
Sure. Thanks, Derek. Thanks for having me on the show this morning. I'm pretty excited to talk with you again. Love talking to customers about cloud security and pretty passionate about the topic. I guess, I came to AWS about 7.5 years ago after working in security architecture and engineering roles at some big banks and a couple big enterprises. The thing that motivated me most about the cloud from the prospect of security was just speed. It took, a long time to do security projects. They were capital intensive, took a lot of meetings to the investment committee, a lot of proof of concept, a lot of hardware kit, a lot of rack and stack. Just took a really long time. The pace of IT was a little slower back then. Procurement took a longer time. You're buying, multi-million-dollar sets of hardware and security solutions, and that's a pretty big investment. So you got to kind of get it right. And so it constrains you. It constrains the speed at which you can move. And security really has to be the fastest thing in the enterprise, faster than the threat landscape, faster than the regulatory landscape, and certainly keeping up to enable the business to grow in a secure way. And I saw cloud as this programmable way to provision infrastructure. Principally, you could see you had better visibility. You could query things with APIs. And so you had just the ability to move a little faster. Solutions were built, data center architectures were built in text files, things like CloudFormation templates or Terraform templates. So the design of a network architecture, the design of a monitoring infrastructure is just so much more flexible. You could treat it as code. You can make small iterative changes. If you use partner solutions and vendors from the security industry, you can select those in a much more dynamic fashion. And I think it presented a possibility to me that we could move the security industry a lot faster if it could be more programmable and more flexible versus CapEx purchases and large data center buildouts. So I think that's what really motivated me to come to cloud. It's just making security faster, right? I think as things have progressed, we've invested a lot in security over the years. We have around 30 security services. If you include some of the governance and management services, that's democratizing security. And it's one of the things we've been focused on a lot lately is making sure that, anybody from a developer with a credit card to large enterprises, banks and financial firms like Goldman Sachs or Barclays or Vanguard, Fidelity. I mean, a lot of the folks that are AWS customers and moving to the cloud in earnest, they all get the same features. So we make an innovation in cryptography, we make an innovation in monitoring. Everybody benefits from that. And so there's no additional investment on the part of the customer. They can just wake up every day and get a few new features. So I guess that's what motivated me to come to the cloud. And I think we're making good progress on making security faster.
Yeah, one of the things, Bill, you mentioned that just gave me a flashback was, earlier in my career, I remember having to do some, what now in an easy API that you provide to do traffic mirroring is something that, many years ago, I used to have to sit there and pour through, especially around fiber optics, trying to tap into fiber optics and figure out, okay, the prism can't divert more than X% of light over this distance, and all these things to calculate. I didn't really care about, the prisms and capturing light. What I was really caring about is how do I see this data that's flowing over this line? But it was so complicated, and it was, especially at that time, it was, quite capital intense to say, hey, I want to monitor, how many different fiber optic links, and this is going to cost me tens of thousands of dollars. And now I look at, what you released, I think it was last year at Reinforce, was basically, hey, you just, here's this API. You can turn on traffic mirroring. You can turn it off. You can, move it this way. You can move it that way. You can analyze it with our tools or somebody else's tools. I mean, that's just immensely different than even 10 years ago.
I agree. I think one of the things that's pushed the security industry, both as a challenge and an opportunity, is to be more engineering focused. I think a lot of people, most security organizations did a lot of buy, like they bought a lot of their security tools. And that's still the case. There's still a robust partner ecosystem, and a lot of folks in the marketplace and traditional security partners are great. I think a lot of it has come down to more of a builder culture, though. Developers, engineers, architects, they can go out and pick from almost 200 services to build data platforms, analytics platforms, the next level of machine learning architectures. Security, has that same benefit now, and security can build. What it comes down to, though, and I'd say our most mature customers, is the security engineering teams are working, hand in hand with developers. The same things like identity, detective controls, infrastructure security, the perimeter, all that can now be defined in software, whether that's templates or code or scripts. Those artifacts get pushed out along with the application. They're using modern continuous integration, continuous deployment platforms, whether that's open source stuff like Jenkins or partner solutions like the Atlassian stack, or things like our code platform, so code commit, code deploy, code build, etc. Getting security working in that software factory has been a really accelerant to partnering up with the engineering organization. So I'd say the most mature customers are federating out their security internally as well. It's just impossible for a central security team to manage every workload. They have to rely on partnerships with their engineering teams. Seeing more and more that customers' development organizations are hiring security engineers into those development shops, not just relying on a central security organization. A lot of customers do it with a cloud center of excellence, just so they get they get over the hump in terms of getting kind of everybody on board. Maybe it's a centralized function, but it turns pretty quickly to be decentralized and federated, where they can move faster and independently, but with a known set of good artifacts and good central patterns that a security team has helped build. I think a clear sign of whether a security organization is kind of moving along at the right speed is how many code commits are the security organization doing into the code repos of the rest of the company, right, or the rest of the firm. So they're building APIs of their own. They're publishing templates and products in a service catalog, things like that other dev teams can use that are hardened and meet the control requirements of the CISO and the risk officer. But they're committing that same code back to a repository of artifacts for the rest of the development organization to use. It's great to see, honestly, and
it's quite different. I mean, it's really quite different from yesteryear. When I think about I've been doing this over 20 years. When I think about earlier in my career as a security officer, it was really about we talk about shift left, and I'd like to cover that, but it was really the very right hand side of that equation. It was really after the code's been pushed, after we've had it, after it's already been smoke tested and it's out there and users are using it. Security was really kind of a bouncer at the door. It was, how do I detect what's happening at the very last stage from the public, from the users, and how do I prevent things, and effectively security officers, many years ago were kind of in that mindset of how do I shut this down? If this isn't the way I want this, or this isn't the way it should be, how do I just stop it? And I see now when I work with my clients, especially who are in cloud, that they've really done that shift left. They've really started to not only integrate their security teams into the development practices, where before they were probably more focused, honestly, on endpoints and end users rather than the data and the applications. And now that they've shifted over, they're catching things much easier. And I think it leads to less consternation than maybe when I was an early security officer, is because I didn't have to go in there and say, hey, there's a problem, you need to stop what you're doing. Instead, it's kind of more of the, let me help you, show you the pattern and practice that'll make this successful. And then that way, when you release the final code, everybody knows, security development, everybody knows that this is good to go. It doesn't mean there can't be issues, afterwards, but it means everybody's prepared and on the same page instead of kind of this adversarial relationship, right?
I agree. I think there's two factors that have facilitated that. One is there's an earlier signal. The ability to detect new applications and new workloads under development is just faster in the cloud. So if someone's spinning up a new account within your organization, you don't have to choose between yes and no. You can choose to let people continue to innovate and be autonomous, but have visibility into that. So you let a developer move fast. Maybe like good example is creating identity roles within AWS. So if you are building an application inside of AWS and you want to call a bunch of other APIs, right? Rather than having fixed credentials like password to databases, things like that, you have what are known as instance roles or execution roles or identity and access management roles that applications can assume. So you're essentially giving an application an identity, temporary short-term credentials that are constantly rotated. Great signal for a security team to see that a developer is in the early stages of building an application. You can let them build and just alarm on things, monitor what they're creating, and then when they're creating critical resources like identity policies or encryption keys or network resources, new internet endpoints like load balancers, security can say, looks like they're doing some development over there. It's 180 days, 200 days from going production. We're going to get in there really early and see it. And so you just have that signal and that visibility. The other thing I think that's happened and continues to happen is we're freeing up resources, right? I mean, security teams used to be focused on, if you look at most traditional security teams in big enterprises, they have, large analytics platforms like SIMs and things like that. And those are fantastic solutions. But I'd wager that a decent portion of the time spent by security engineers is keeping that infrastructure running, right? Keeping their own databases optimized, keeping their own analytics platforms and the ETL, the extract, transform, load of log messages and analytics. They're having to pull all that in. And that's a lot of infrastructure plumbing and a lot of time doing systems administration work that could be better spent doing application security reviews and analytics and deep dives on threat actors, things like that. And so I think we're giving time back is one of the things. They're not focused on infrastructure security as much. They're not having to do anything with patch panels or physical firewalls. The infrastructure runs. It's easy to replace and upgrade. And that all happens because of cloud. And so they're able to focus more on their own applications, right? Using the SIM tools to the best of their ability, not having to maintain the storage, being able to focus on developer code, not necessarily every little infrastructure bit and byte that has to support that new application. They can really focus on what the developer is trying to do. We talk a lot about undifferentiated heavy lifting and how we try to help remove that. I'll tell you, running a key management system is a thankless job. Right? It's a tier 0 service. It cannot fail. If you lose access to your encryption keys, your data is unavailable. Super, super expensive, very capital intensive, absolutely, top availability requirements in almost any company. And we have KMS. It supports over 100 services. Somewhere around 60 of those services, you manage your own keys, your own customer managed keys. You have visibility into the policies on those keys, who's using those keys, who you've given an ability to grant on that key to decrypt an object or decrypt an instance or something like that. So I think it's a classic example of just freeing up that time and giving security engineers and security operations folks the ability to focus on the core of what they're supposed to do.
Well, I think the other great thing especially with the key management there is not only do you take it, you make it much easier to, like you said, rotate and track and manage that, but also it's a primitive that can be easily leveraged across so many services. So you can apply those keys. You don't have to have different systems of key management and different systems of key integration between storage and other elements. And I think that's very advantageous as well, as you can use the same constructs, the same principles, and just leverage those over and over and over, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and the cost is dramatically reduced as well. If you look at, encryption is a good example, logging is a good example, permission policies, and what we have is with service control policies and all the access kind of administration, that's largely either free and just built into the platform or a very nominal cost. And you're only paying for what you use versus buying, say, a giant key management infrastructure with a bunch of HSMs on premises. That's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in some cases. So it's being able to democratize encryption. Werner Vogels, our CTO, has been, on stage at reinvent every year, pretty much encouraging customers to encrypt everywhere, right? And we want to make that possible so that it's no longer a choice between, it's really expensive to encrypt this data. Maybe I won't do it versus there's really no reason not to encrypt the data. Right?
Yeah, and I like to tie that to what we were talking about before, which is, now the security teams and the developments kind of together, or developers together, or independently, but the security teams can now give those common patterns to the developers and basically say, hey, if you're going to store something, or if you're going to if you're going to roll out this application with EBS, or however you're going to design your application, here are the ways in which key management will run and operate. Here's how you can leverage these keys. Here's what we've either created for you or you can create and leverage, and just do this consistently. And you take away a lot of that, either the friction of kind of a developer saying, I don't know how to use key management systems. I don't want to know how to use an HSM and deal with that. But you also take, in addition to that, taking away that friction, you also accelerate their ability to be compliant, so that you don't have to follow back. And you can still do that, right? So through config rules or whatever, you can still ensure that things were created the way they should be. But at the same time, you're hopefully having that team go forward knowing that first, instead of having to effectively having to catch them and stop them and having to go back again. So I think that's been, the enablement of, just use this principle, use this practice, and further will ensure, kind of trust but verify, will ensure that that you've done that correctly in case you don't know. And it really helps enable those teams be successful, where maybe before there was just too much friction or too much concern.
Yeah, and encryption is one of those areas where you really don't want to make it up on the fly. You want to use known patterns. Anytime we, internally, anytime anybody is using encryption inside of AWS, we have a team of crypto bar raisers. They're basically cryptographers and people who are really excellent, not only at cryptography itself as a practice with the math and everything, but also just the implementation, using libraries correctly, using policies correctly on keys. It's not something you want every team making up themselves, right? Having those known patterns and really ensuring that they're using proper algorithms and cipher suites. And those are all things that you want really consistently done across the enterprise, especially if you have compliance requirements for federal government workloads or PCI or other things that have pretty stringent cryptography requirements. So.
Yeah, some of the other democratizing elements I see, I think it was perhaps your boss at reInvent last year, where there was kind of this point of, here's the top 10 critical security items that you should do. And I think there was a later presentation a couple of months ago where I really liked it. It seems very simple, but I liked the statement of, if you do nothing else, at least turn on Security Hub and turn on Guard Duty, and it's going to cost you very little, and it's going to give you a lot more coverage than the alternative of not having those on. And I see that across, both very large companies who have extensive SIM environments and have lots of analysts and go through these things daily, who still don't have, maybe some visibility into cloud API access that GuardDuty is going to give them, or don't have some of the configuration compliance that the Security Hub's config rules specifically are going to give them. So can you talk about kind of the conformance packs and just where AWS might be going with some of those elements, those provable elements there?
Yeah, I think provable is an interesting word. I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, Steve, my boss, our CISO, Steve Schmidt, presented the top 10 simple things you need to go, every customer ought to go off and do. And those are just really basic hygiene things like enabling multi-factor authentication on your root account or any direct console access, turning on and managing Guard Duty. It's super simple to turn on. It is, again, I think one of our examples of trying to democratize some of the traditionally very expensive things that you would have to do on your own. So Guard Duty, it takes a look at VPC flow logs, whether you have them turned on or not. It takes a look at CloudTrail logs, whether you have those a custom trail turned on or not. Again, those are flow logs you can store and analyze yourself. And CloudTrail is on by default for 90 days in the console, and you can certainly turn that on in a custom trail and send it to S3 or a SIM product or a log analytics product. But and customers continue to do that for other reasons. But Guard Duty does it without you having to plumb up any infrastructure. It looks at basically anomalous. It builds up a pattern model or a behavior model of how you're using your account, both from a control plane API perspective with CloudTrail and then network flows with VPC flow logs. And it after a period of time, it learns what normal looks like and identifies anomalies in those API patterns or traffic patterns. Furthermore, it integrates different sources of threat intelligence, CrowdStrike and Proofpoint, and our own sources of threat intelligence that compares the API calls being made, the network flows being made, and initiating into your account against known threat actors, whether you supply the threat actor lists or we supply them through our partnerships. It compares the activity in your account to known bad actors. So things coming from Tor nodes, things coming from known command and control hosts where we have threat intelligence, and that you could build that yourself. And some customers had on top of AWS before, but this becomes so much more simpler when we have direct access to the infrastructure and those. It looks at DNS logs as well, DNS queries, to see if your EC2 instances are reaching out to algorithmically generated domain names. It's a pretty good sign that might be compromised hosts. So trying to make that possible for everyone. It's super easy to turn on. I'd say Security Hub is pretty similar. Now, we launched the foundational security best practices standard into Security Hub about a month and a half, I want to say, ago. And that's just a reflection of kind of well-architected principles, some of the things you use to find a trusted advisor, as well as a whole bunch of best practices we've collected, over time. And it's a pretty easy way to turn on and see either through that standard or the Center for Internet Security foundational benchmark for AWS, something we partner with CIS on. Kind of see how you're doing and give a pretty quick look at the configuration and the sort of adherence to best practices. I'll break it down. The conformance packs versus the security best practices stuff in Security Hub. We're classic Amazonian fashion. We want to create a lot of selection for customers. Some developers want to use certain services. Some developers want to have a more managed service. So the differentiation, the way to think about this is Security Hub uses managed config rules and potentially other code to do really, I'd say, pretty dogmatic and prescriptive checking. Right? It's our opinionated view of what your best practices ought to be. Not a lot of customization that you need to do or could do. Conformance packs are part of SSM or Systems Manager, and they also kind of go along with config rules, but you have a little bit more ability to customize some of those if that's the need you have. And again, it's a little bit of a difference in perspective. If you want more of a managed service, then Security Hub is kind of the way to go there. Conformance packs are a little bit more customizable. So certainly we have customers using both. And it depends on which team wants which perspective. So we're pretty clear in the documentation, the FAQ around Security Hub about when to use which one. So I push customers to read up on that a little bit. But
I like how you said, Bill, in there. You talk about the opinionated items of the top 10, and I think earlier in my career I was very much kind of hey, I need as much control as you can possibly give me, kind of like you're saying with conformance packs and self-defining some of those config rules and things. But then especially as a more consulting work is the question I get asked probably the most of all my customers is kind of the either what are other people doing or what should I be doing that I don't know about. And I think at least that top 10 gives people a start, right? Is kind of hey, if you don't evaluate anything else at this moment, just start here and just see what you get. Even if you don't agree, I think one of the findings is kind of must have a hardware MFA. And I think for some customers, maybe hardware MFA is not quite, maybe virtual MFA is okay. And so things like that, or they could tweak, or they could customize, or they could disable that rule or something in the future. But at least it gives them a start, right?
Exactly. If you went really opinionated, Control Towers made some really big advances. When it launched, it was a really prescriptive way of, we had this solution called Landing Zone, which is a really popular pattern that customers use. They were either building it themselves with open source tools or stuff on premises, or just even some of the partner solutions, or they did home build, basically a combination of an account vending machine. So someplace inside the company where developers who want to use AWS can go get a new account. It's registered to the organization. It's got some integrations with ticketing or with identity management and SSO and those kind of things. But customers were having to build that themselves. So we came out with Landing Zone a few years ago. A bunch of code that you run in your environment uses code pipeline and CloudFormation and kind of pre-plumbed out that environment for you. Pretty prescriptive in terms of the account vending machine account. It had a logging account. It had kind of a shared network. But customers, they wanted even simpler. So they wanted, again, more opinionated, more dogmatic, and more prescriptive. So we launched Control Tower, which was this extremely, rigid kind of way to build accounts, very in a good way, following AWS best practices. And so in the last couple of months, they've made leaps and bounds of feature flow. Super proud of that team. They now allow you to pull in older accounts, which was, I think, the big thing that customers were waiting for. So you can set it up in an existing organization. It'll build out a couple of OUs. It'll build out organizational units. It will build out a logging archive account and an audit account. And then it builds that vending machine so that developers can easily get access to accounts. But this concept of guardrails, there's mandatory guardrails. I think about 20 of them when you launch the product that are just super prescriptive. You encrypt your logs at rest. They'll be write only, be read only to the audit account. I mean, there's just a bunch of really mandatory hygiene, what we call guardrails, that are provisioned by default when you use Control Tower. So a customer coming to AWS today, I mean, even an existing one who wants to get really standardized on that kind of, opinionated view, you can use Control Tower. A customer coming to the cloud today, though, is getting a much different experience than one even a couple of years ago in terms of governance and guardrails and having that centralized management where it matters, but having that autonomy and that independence and kind of speed for the developers to use in a very safe way. So pretty happy about that.
Yeah, I really like those directive controls rather, and that governance integration. I think, especially for the larger organizations we've worked with, who have been on the cloud journey for much longer than maybe smaller and medium sized businesses, where they have account sprawl at this point. We've gone into customers where they say, I have over 200 accounts. I don't even know if people are spinning up accounts. How do we rectify this? How do we integrate this? And I think before we could point to landing zone, we could point to Control Tower, but now that, as you say, is now you can also just bring them over, or at least show that pattern for here's how you're going to need to bring these accounts today, and obviously that could take some time through legacy, but then going forward, here's really the model. And inevitably, Bill, all engineers are kind of hey, this won't fit, for my weird extreme use case XYZ, but I think it helps justify then kind of you may have exceptional use cases, but in large regard, 99% of your account management, of how you need logs to flow through, kind of the guardrails you mentioned, whether those are service control policies or other things, is these are the basic constructs you should probably be trying to adhere to, unless you have extremely good reason to have exception, and then furthermore justify that exception if you're going to try and deviate too far, right?
I'll speak a little bit about account management. One of the things we published a blog recently on onboarding services in highly regulated environments. And I'd say most of the large financial institutions and highly regulated customers on AWS have come up with some kind of service onboarding process. The developers want to kick the tires. They want to use the latest and greatest. But the CISO and the risk officer and the compliance teams need to have a little bit of professional courtesy there to give them some time to come across the service, figure out where logs need to go, how identity is going to work, how encryption might work in that service. We typically find that when we launch a new service, it's anywhere from a couple of days in a really small service or a very agile organization to a couple of weeks, where the security team can build out those templates. They can define the guardrails. They can integrate, any sort of all the services, depending on, how high up the stack you move, are going to have obviously CloudTrail logs, but they might have application logs or things that go to CloudWatch events or CloudWatch logs custom to that particular service. So, you got to give a security team a little bit of time to reason about the correctness of a service and how it's going to be used. But then they kind of put it in their service catalog, or they allow accounts to use it via service control policies. But, it's kind of this negotiation a little bit of, how quickly can we onboard these new services? Accounts, customers moving at speed in the cloud they do have a lot of accounts, and that's a management challenge in terms of managing all those accounts in a consistent way, which I think Control Tower helps with. A lot of the new services, Security Hub, Macy, Access Analyzer, a bunch of the services are now integrated with organizations, so you can turn them on centrally and have them go to one delegated admin account for that visibility.
Yeah, that aggregation is extremely powerful, right? I don't want to, even a security analyst, is you would not want to try and pull in, let's say, guard duty findings across 20, 30, 100 accounts. That would be very painful.
You need to pull them in centrally, but you don't want to have to configure that all on individual accounts. You want to do that in kind of a central way. I think we made a lot of progress there. I would describe to customers sometimes, wild animals, tagged animals, and zoo animals when it comes to accounts. Mm-hmm. The wild animals are the accounts you might not know about, and there's mechanisms to detect accounts that aren't under management from the central organization or something. Customers can work with their sales teams, they can work with their technical account managers to make sure they know about all the accounts in an organization. And then I think there's what I call tagged animals or tagged accounts, where you know about the account. You might have visibility into it, who's responsible for it, if there's production or non-production data in that account, but it might not be fully managed. And then you have, I consider zoo animals, which are ones that are fully managed, right? They're fully contained and centrally governed. And I think it's a good way to think about accounts, especially when you have mergers and acquisitions and different business units across a large company. You're going to end up with a lot of folks using AWS and other clouds, to be honest. And getting governance across that's really important. I think the center of excellence, the cloud center of excellence concept is a good one. Communication though is everything, right? So back in before cloud, people would go out and outsource things, like outside of IT. It's really a cry for help, and it's a need for agility. And so if you let people move fast, but as long as that communication is there, it's like, here's how you get cloud, right? Here's the approved way the organization has decided we're going to use cloud. But if people don't know about that, and you've got 9 different business units across 50 different countries, people are going to do what they need to do to get their job done. And so communication and lowering that bar of entry and lowering that friction to get cloud is super important. It's not just the responsibility of security; they have a big role, but procurement, cost and finance, governance, all those roles in the enterprise still have a role to play, but they got to make it accessible, right? If they build such a high bar to get access to IT resources, people are going to find a way to get their job done. And so having a well communicated path to the cloud, here's a service ticket, here's a product catalog, here's the team you engage, and allow you to kind of start easily. That's you kind of have to have that culture, right? Is that we're gonna it's the default yes versus a default no. Is yes, you can use cloud, but here's how you do it correctly. The nice thing is you're really able to experiment too with AWS and cloud in general. You're not paying for things up front, right? So certainly AWS is pay as you go, allows you to experiment, iterate, fail quickly, retool or pivot what you're working on without a huge capital expenditure up front, which is kind of the reason why there was such a hard gate in IT to getting resources, because you're buying servers, you're buying network infrastructure. It's kind of a commitment up front before you really even prove out what you're trying to do. And now you can.
Well, yeah, and then you're also trying to, especially if there's capitalization there, is you're trying to show, over the depreciation life cycle of this asset, prove to me the return you're going to have, and you can't really experiment when that's the case unless you're experimenting. Early in my career used to be, hey, there's some old servers we're about to send to the scrapyard. You can go ahead and use those. Right. And that's not, honestly, that's not going to give people success using old things.
Right.
I think, Bill, you brought up one thing where, going back to my example of security used to be the bouncer. It used to be the main statements were no or don't do that. And I think, you brought the point up of, now it's much more like try it this way or test it first. Is go ahead and do this and test it, and maybe security's not right, or maybe what the assumptions that security has about how this might work or how it may or may not be compliant may be conceptual. So go ahead and give this a shot. You can test it in a sandbox over here in a very controlled environment. Like you said, it's not going to cost you tremendously upfront. Give it a shot, and then security compliance can review if need be, or we can run automated tools against that and verify that, basically prove your hypothesis rather than just immediately saying, nope, can't happen.
Yeah. And I think the culture is changing even in the engineering organizations. Security, I still think we have work to do in the industry to start teaching elementary school kids and high school kids and college kids and CS degrees a little bit more on the security side, making part of that core curriculum. But I do think that engineering managers and, developers and senior architects, they understand that security is another quality attribute, right? They don't want to write buggy code. They want to write performant code. They also want to write secure code, and having that willingness to understand that compliance is a reality, that companies that operate in the global regulatory environment have obligations. That's not just the security team and the audit team making life difficult for you. It's really a core part of earning trust of your customers, of earning trust of your regulators. And I think the culture of development and engineering has changed. Certainly, coming from banks and seeing progress over 20 plus years in security as well is that culture is changing. I think that even your average person with a computer is a little bit more aware of passwords and multi-factor authentication than they used to be, and that's certainly seeped into the engineering organizations, especially in our regulated customers. They know that they're going to have to get security to sign off. They're going to have to demonstrate control effectiveness. That audit and compliance stakeholders are part of the personas they're targeting, as well as their end users or business partners. It's just I'm optimistic is my point.
Yeah, I would agree. I would even point to a very simple example. I was talking to a customer recently, and they had effectively, and it seems small, but they had effectively renamed their compliance team to the trust and assurance team.
That's
And I
awesome.
thought, that's, even though it's small in its naming, that's a step in the right direction, right? Is that showing what the value outcome they're trying to get to. Compliance is a driver, but really what they were trying to build was trust of their customers and assurance that, like you said, the quality was there, and that quality extends to, in this case, the financial and personal data that they were collecting and maintaining and managing, on behalf of their teams.
Exactly. Yeah, that stewardship concept I think is really important. It's a a good corporate value. And one of our leadership principles at Amazon is earn the trust of others, and I think one of the ways we embody that is making security a top priority.
So, Bill, what are some of the kind of the emerging or innovative services that you're permitted to talk to us about,
Sure.
that maybe really are oriented towards either improving what you've already offered, or are really about making things more effective or efficient in security and compliance?
I highlight, I guess, three things that are kind of fascinating to me right now. One is organizations, and it's been out there a couple of years, but it is a huge part of our investment strategy. Customers want to have consistency in how they manage accounts. I know we've touched on this already, but there's still a lot of customers out there that predate organizations, and they're moving as fast as they can to get their accounts under organizations. But you see, the feature flow from the orgs team has just been fantastic, and they've been knocking out integrations and automations and things like there's stack sets, there's control towers a part of this in terms of driving organizations, but getting your cloud estate as a company into AWS organizations is a durable advantage. It's going to pay forward. We're going to continue to innovate around organizations to make it easier to manage things centrally. Can't emphasize that enough. We're spending a lot of time with customers, moving them into orgs, and the new customers that are coming on today are taking advantage of that. So I'm very happy about that. A lot of feature flow there, and it's just one of those things that we launch a little bit every day, but cumulatively and over time, it amounts to a lot. So I think if you're an AWS customer, talking to your account teams, your solution architects, reading the security blogs, those kind of things, you'll see the value of pivoting toward organizations and leaning in more toward it. Nitro is something we've been talking about for a while. It's a concept, that's been out there for a couple of years now. All the new instance families are built on our Nitro architecture and the Nitro hypervisor. That was a long-term investment, right? So, I mean, we worked with Annapurna Labs to fabricate our own chips, and we have the Nitro security chip and Nitro cards that kind of break out the functions of the hypervisor onto separate hardware. Really long-term advantage, though, in terms of being able to launch things like Nitro Enclaves we announced last year. It's a new computing model for kind of a trusted execution environment. Really happy about that. That'll launch later this year in GA.
What value would that bring to a customer? So what would they gain out of that, whether they knew it or not?
Yeah. So one of the most common patterns is dealing with encrypted data. Right. So if you have an application that's running on a server, presumably someone might have access to that server. So at some point in dealing with encrypted ciphertext, that data is going to be plain text in memory, right? And so having an operator with access or an application with access to that ciphertext data is something we'd all love to avoid. So our enclave's similar to an HSM, but not at all as expensive and not at all as constraining. Enclaves will let you carve out resources from an instance into an enclave that has no network access and no human access to that data. So you can pass in encrypted data. It'll have a path to get keys out of KMS back through the instance initially. And then deal with both the plain text key as well as the plain text data that you're decrypting, operate on that data, get your results, re-encrypt that data if necessary, and then pass that data back to an application where no human could have accessed that data while it was in process, right? So it's an environment to deal with encrypted data is a great example. Tokenization is another fine example where you pass in data, it tokenizes it and matches it to real, plain text data, and then hands back either token value or some result, where you don't ever need to have a human or an application with access to that plain text data. So it's a confidential or trusted execution environment. There's attestation, cryptographic attestation about the integrity of the image going into the enclave, and the code that you're running is cryptographically validated. So it's a newer model, much more we think accessible from a developer pattern and programmability model. Pretty happy about that. But again, Nitro, that investment in hardware and hypervisor architecture has allowed us to build something like enclaves. It's allowed us to move the trust off of the processor that the customer's code is running on, and move the management, control plane, storage, and networking functions off of the same CPU basically as where the computer, the customer's code is running. So there's a lot more isolation within the Nitro architecture from a security perspective. A couple of really good talks, Anthony Ligori and others who helped build that from reInvent and past conferences that are up on YouTube. It's definitely Nitro is pretty exciting. I'd say, the third area that we're continuing to invest in and have a fantastic team working on is around encryption. So we've done some submissions to NIST of what we think are quantum safe crypto algorithms. We've implemented those already on the KMS service endpoints. So in addition to TLS and perfect forward secrecy, you're also seeing some modern implementations of what we consider to be quantum safe, at least today, and what we understand about quantum computing, what we think are quantum safe algorithms for transport encryption in a modern era that we think are stronger and ready to be defending customers' TLS sessions in the world where quantum computers might exist. So I'm super happy about those. I'd say you mentioned provable security, and I'll add a fourth thing here. We recently posted an article about this on Amazon.science, which is kind of our research and development page that highlights a lot of our work in this area. But we have a team called Automated Reasoning, and they're using basically logic to prove security. So when you have a code path and you can execute that entire code path, you can turn that analysis into a math problem, essentially, or a logic problem.
Right.
And you can exercise every part of that code path to prove something is or isn't true. And so this is coming from folks that have been at NASA and other academic institutions to use formal proofing and logic, but applying it to security. And it's a really interesting application of academic theories to practical real world problems. We use this technology initially with S3 and reasoning about whether a bucket is open or not, or whether a bucket is shared. But it's kind of the core engine behind Access Analyzer, which launched last year.
Right.
That has organization-wide support now as well. And so it covers things where you have a resource policy. So an S3 bucket, a KMS key, a Lambda function, a trust policy, an IAM, SQS, SNS, and then more in the future. Anywhere there's a resource policy where you can share that resource out across accounts or outside your organization, Access Analyzer will tell you definitively whether that resource has been shared beyond your account. And it doesn't need to look at logs. It doesn't need to try to access the object or the resource. It just calculates it based on the sum total of the policies applied to that resource. It's really interesting. We've also used it in Inspector. It's a feature around network reachability. So if your network can be defined in policy and in software, you're not having to chase down patch panels or walk the cam tables of a switch or find a firewall that's daisy chained to another firewall. Like tracing that out in an old network used to be very challenging and required some physical investment, right? But having automated reasoning sit across your VPC, it can see whether a system is reachable or is not reachable from the internet. And that has a bunch of applications. One is vulnerability management and prioritization. So maybe you have CVEs and you want to fix the internet-facing hosts first, but there's a system that's not reachable from the internet. You can, not that you shouldn't fix it, you should just prioritize them accordingly. Also, sort of attack trees.
Yeah, I would just add to that use case. We've, especially when stepping into, and I think where a lot of that provable element of those policies becomes very valuable is extremely large deployments. We've walked into security consulting for on AWS. Is you walk into in some case hundreds of VPCs with all sorts of security groups, all sorts of endpoints, and on the face of it, we might get hundreds of triggers for hey, you've allowed too permissive access in this security group for SSH for port 22 or RDP for 3389. And to your exact point is when you're looking at environments that large and you're looking at those policy constructs is almost the equivalent, of what you were talking about is, going and pulling cables and things. Is there are so many constructs that how do I prioritize? What should I really be advising this client, or what should my team be remediating in our plans to go tackle first? Because if there are thousands of these, we need to know immediately what are we going to go hit first. And I think that network reachability is a great one of kind of hey, this lateral access from this other VPC, peered VPC, that's fantastic, that's fine, it's trusted, it's okay. We'll get to it, maybe we'll tag it or something. But that other piece of no, really, this actually gets to the internet. This is one you need to lock down first. There's so many policies now that it's so invaluable to have that kind of access to that next level of validation or confirmation.
Yeah, and we want this to be as automated as possible, and we understand that not everybody is going to have I mean, again, skill sets are important, and people need to train their workforce. And just like anything, authorization, whether it's network or identity, has never been, I'd say, super simple, right? I mean, identity management has been, people have large teams running Active Directory. They have large teams running their SSO infrastructure or multiple IDPs, inside their organizations. So having, I think it's important from a resourcing perspective to have folks on staff that do understand IAM policies, they understand resource policies, they understand security groups. I mean, those are things that, you do have to do a little bit of work to learn, right? But I don't think it's hard. It's just work, and somebody has to focus on it. But, obviously tooling is going to help a lot. We don't expect someone to, walk in and reason about all these security groups and policies and stuff without additional help. We have, policy simulator and access analyzer and firewall manager and some of these tools that have come along in the past couple of years to really help get across that with customers. I think it's it's a lot easier than maybe it used to be. And we have a lot of opportunity, I think, to continue improving that, making it simpler.
And so how you're doing that, just to recap that, is it sounds like you're taking, the AWS science, you're taking kind of that more traditionally academic view, whether it's of encryption or of policy management things, and you're eventually translating that into actual service launches and capabilities.
Yeah, that's
Is that
accurate. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And that's fantastic, because I'll tell you, there's so many symposiums and things I've been to throughout my career where I see some great poster session, that a postdoc student is giving on some concept that they're releasing, and I say, hey, this is fantastic. Do you think this could get to the market, or do you, or is there anyone you're working with? Or is anyone interested in this patent or whatnot? And they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, I've written my paper. I'm getting my degree. That's as much as I need. And some of those fantastic things I've seen over my career just never reached the light of day.
Yeah, we have, the most recent post on Amazon Science about the automated reasoning team. It talks about all the PhD interns and folks we have, on staff, and they're really applying it. I mean, it's a whole new world, I think, of research and security to anything you could, code, you can basically write a test for. And so because everything is software, it's really a lot of possibility. We're really optimistic about how this is going to be applied. Certainly seeing the results of that with things like, like Access Analyzer and some of the things in the S3 console, some of the things in the inspector, making some pretty good progress there.
So I know, was it Reinforce was unfortunately due to COVID, was not going to happen this year. Is there anything we can expect as far as in the works that kind of either are you planning to kind of make the same statements and releases throughout the year as you normally would, maybe just not in the big hurrah, or are you kind of bundling these up for the end of the year?
Well, if I had a crystal ball, it's unfortunate. We were really, really excited with Reinforce last year. It was our first independent security conference. Sure, very close and dear to my heart. Really happy about the attendance. I think one of the things I heard, people love reInvent, but I think the consistent comments from people who attended Reinforce was that pretty much everybody around them was a security professional, right? reInvent's big. It's got a great popular security track, but really the focus on security for the compliance and the audit professional as well as the security practitioner, just having that networking. It was a smaller event, a little more time for networking. Pretty bummed that it didn't happen this year, obviously unfortunate circumstances, but we've never been a company that really tries to bundle up a bunch of stuff. I mean, we happen to launch a lot of things at reInvent, but we launch a lot of things every day. Right. Obviously Andy and Werner and others can stand on stage and talk about them in a keynote at reInvent, which is pretty fun and exciting, but every day there's things launching, and the pace isn't all that different, whether there's Reinforce or reInvent. We launch, services and features every single day. So we're going to continue to do that. I'd say, for customers that want that level of engagement that you get from a conference, we're doing a lot of virtual things. We have, summits that are virtual. There's lots of webinars all the time. If customers want that engagement from us, they need to look no further than their account team. Everybody has an account manager. Everybody has a solution architect. Whether they engage them or not, they're ready and standing by, willing to help. They can pull in other resources, specialist solution architects, or partners is a big part of our how we go to market and how we help customers build on the cloud. We're doing this podcast. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways customers can engage. There's YouTube channels and subscriptions and things to all the previous content. So I think there's ample content out there. We're continuing to launch new content. And we continue to talk to customers every day. People have gone to remote work. We're still doing immersion days with customers. We're still doing virtual executive briefings. There's the AWS meetup groups, that are sort of community led. Yep. There's community heroes out there. I know our partners are doing a lot still. So keep up the enthusiasm. I know One of the things I tell internal teams I work with, the field community for security, is just to take this opportunity to learn. I mean, you're not sitting on a plane anymore. You're probably not shuffling around between buildings as much as you have. So you have a little more time to focus. Come up with a learning path for yourself. Find areas, especially in security, where you want to get deeper. I think a good approach, I'd say, for anyone wanting to get real serious or deeper on AWS security, is just to follow the well-architected patterns.
Mm-hmm.
The well-architected pillar, the security pillar within the well-architected framework has 5 areas, 6 if you include compliance. It starts with identity management, detective controls, infrastructure security, data protection, and incident response. And I think, they're all equal, but I think starting left to right, like learning identity, learning detective controls, kind of following the best practices, and just diving deep into what it takes to get that built right is a pretty good use of your time. There's the self-service assessments that you can do in well-architected. If you have a workload in AWS, open up the console and go to the well-architected tool and start doing the kind of the evaluation of at least of security for a given workload. You'll learn a lot. And then where there's gaps in knowledge or skill sets, or you have areas for improvement, reach out to your account teams, hit up the support forums, look at videos. I mean, This Is My Architecture is a great video series about how to solve specific problems. There's all kinds of stuff that customers can do in terms of a learning path in lieu of conferences. Things like the conferences are fun. I love them. I miss them. But there's certainly, the biggest part of our conferences has always been educational. Certainly a networking component, but I think they're really hands-on conferences. So there's security jams, and there's all kinds of labs and workshops and boot camps and interactive sessions like builder sessions, workshops. Those can all still be executed today. I mean, we have the security workshops are open source. All the modules are up there on the internet. Customers can run them themselves. They can work with their account team or a partner to kind of run some of those events and do them virtually. Keeping up that engagement is really high.
Excellent. Yeah, I know that, used to be a case where every 2 weeks I'd look at, the AWS blog for security news and things like that. And now it seems like, Bill, your release pace is so great that I think it's almost every other day I now have to look.
Yeah, one of the things that customers do express to us is there's just a lot. There's just a lot to learn. We're launching new features every day. They're having to maintain their on-premise state. They might have multiple clouds. To get the focus really. I mean, we launch a lot of things and helping customers understand what to prioritize and what's important. We want to be a partner, not a vendor. And so, partners tell you where to focus. They prioritize things. They highlight the launches that are most important to you. And I think, our enterprise customers are deeply, deeply engaged with their account teams. I'd say, that's probably the one thing that I would encourage everyone to do is just make contact with your account team, make sure they know what your challenges are, and that they're aligned to help you, prioritize those feature launches. And as much as we launch everything every day, not every customer is going to be able to turn that on a dime. So having the account teams, kind of tell you, what's launched recently and what you might think is important based on the services you're using. It's a really good pattern to get in practice.
And obviously they can point out things that you may not even be aware of, or they can keep tabs on some things that, like you were saying with organizations, is I've seen that directly is a lot of the aggregation and the delegation that can be achieved through organizations now is changing at a good pace in terms of being more inclusive of services. And that's the kind of thing too is occasionally you just need a reminder from someone of, hey, now this can be deployed in this way, or now this can be integrated in a way that maybe it couldn't a week ago. So
Exactly.
that's really good to have someone who can keep some tabs on that for you. Well, Bill, I think we've covered quite a few topics today, and really appreciate your time. There was quite a bit around some of the change in positive change in the culture and practices of security teams, and kind of working more closely with the application developers, with the infrastructure release. Also, kind of covering some of those patterns and practices. Great example you gave was landing zone to control tower, going from a basic pattern and practice to even up to an actual managed service. And then you've given us some great insight into some of the developments and some of the new items that are coming about, and what a lot of the research is proving out to be very valuable in terms of actual service delivery too. So really appreciate your time today. And is there anything parting wisdom or next steps that you would advise other than the education you mentioned?
No, thank you so much for the time. It's really been enjoyable to talk with you and work with you guys as a partner. I'm really happy about getting to spend time with you and talk to our mutual customers and potential customers and folks using the cloud about things we're excited about. I think the thing I'd leave everybody with is just optimism, right? Security people, tend to talk about risk a lot, and sometimes it's hard and thankless, but it is getting better. And I think I always tell people in our security field, you have to be the most optimistic person in the room, right? I mean, we're going to solve these problems in the security challenges in the industry. We're making a ton of progress, and I think I'm really optimistic about security being fun, and you get to be a builder again. And I think it's a whole, it's really fun to do security in the cloud. It becomes it's been a great career. It continues to be, and I'm really excited about what our customers are doing with the platform to be secure and continually raise that bar. So yeah, thank you so much for the time.
Completely agree. Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
To our listeners, if you want to know more, go to intervision.com for the show notes and more information.
You've been listening to the Status Go podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes or get more information at intervision.com. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, find Intervision on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thank you for listening. Until next time.